Look around at the world we've inherited. The grand cathedrals, the cyclopean monuments, the doors built for beings 3 times our height. We've been told these were constructed by our ancestors, primitive people who somehow achieved architectural perfection we can barely replicate today. But what if that story is a comfortable lie? What if the truth is far stranger and more unsettling than anything you've been taught? The evidence has always been there, hiding in plain sight. We just weren't asking the right questions. Today we're going to follow a trail of clues that leads from buried cities to orphaned children, from empty photographs to ancient weapons of unimaginable power. And at the end of this investigation, you'll see history not as a smooth progression of civilizations, but as a series of catastrophic resets, each one erasing what came before. Let's start with something simple, something you've probably noticed yourself if you've ever walked through an old city center. The windows. Have you ever wondered why so many ground floor windows in historical buildings seem to descend directly into the sidewalk? Why doors open into solid walls of compacted earth? The standard explanation is cultural layers, the gradual accumulation of debris over centuries. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look at the actual numbers. We're not talking about a few inches of buildup. Old photographs from cities across America and Europe show buildings buried under 5, 6, sometimes 23 feet of soil. That's the height of an entire floor, sometimes 2 floors, simply swallowed by the earth. Imagine walking down a street in 19th century Seattle or Kansas City and seeing majestic stone structures with only their upper portions visible, like icebergs hiding their true mass beneath the surface. This wasn't a slow process. Something rapid and violent happened. The official history tells us about street regrading projects, about taming the terrain for urban development. But can a simple engineering project explain buildings buried to their roofs? Can it explain the massive cliffs of earth that appeared in the middle of cities, nearly vertical walls of compacted soil whose flat tops suggest they were once a single higher ground level? The scale is too immense, the violence too sudden. Look at the photographs from that era. You'll see steam shovels, those steel monsters hissing with steam and clanking with metal, working around the clock. They laid temporary railway tracks right through city streets, and entire trains hauled the soil away in an endless procession. But here's what makes no sense. Alongside these conventional methods, we see something stranger. Powerful jets of water, like giant fire hoses, being sprayed at vertical walls of earth. The official caption reads, "Street regrading, but why would you turn tons of earth into slurry? It's incredibly inefficient. Mud complicates everything, creates chaos, requires additional effort for collection and removal." Unless, of course, that earth wasn't ordinary soil at all. In Alaska during the same period, gold miners faced a similar problem. The precious metal lay beneath thick layers of frozen muck, a solid mass of permafrost, soil, ice, and debris. Digging was impossible, so they used the only method that worked. They washed it away with powerful jets of water, thawing the rock-hard mass into liquid slurry. The method is identical to what we see in Seattle. Identical. The term used in official documents is revealing. They called them glacial hills, not metaphorically, not as a geological term describing events from millennia ago. They were glacial. Frozen. In Seattle, at the 47th parallel, where the climate should never support permafrost. Something brought ice there, something massive. Here's the hypothesis that fits all the facts. What if relatively recently, perhaps only 100 to 200 years ago, the Basabese where Seattle now stands was hit by a giant ice tsunami? Not just a wave of water, but a colossal moving mass of ice shards, mud, silt from the ocean floor, everything ground up in its path. This monstrous wave swept across the land, burying the landscape and everything on it. Then, because of the enormous amount of ice in its composition, this slurry froze, forming what was later called glacial hills. Not true geological permafrost formed over millennia, but flash permafrost, the result of a single catastrophic event. This explains everything. The colossal volume of soil that suddenly appeared, the strange method of removal using water, which was essentially a thawing process. Even the name itself, glacial hills, building on such an unstable thawing surface was impossible, so it had to be washed away and dumped into the sea. But here's where the theory hits a wall. Kansas City, This city is thousands of miles from any ocean, in the very center of the continent, at an altitude of nearly 900 feet above sea level. No tsunami, not even the most unimaginable one in planetary history, could have reached it. Yet the buildings there were buried to the same depth, if not greater, 23 feet of dense clay and earth, covering stone structures. If water didn't do this, what did? The early photographs of Kansas City show something different. The terrain is uneven, undulating, like underwater sand dunes or the frozen waves of desert dunes. This doesn't look like it was covered by wet mud or silt. It looks like it was buried under a huge mass of something loose and dry. And there's another detail, the almost complete absence of mature old trees, only young saplings. As if not so long ago, perhaps 50 years before the photograph was taken, this was a practically barren area, devoid of vegetation that could restrain the movement of soil. What if the central regions of the continent fell victim to a completely different element? Air. What if these lands were hit by dust or sandstorms of apocalyptic force? Not the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which was bad enough, but something far worse. A whole series of catastrophic storms that lasted for years, perhaps decades, methodically burying everything in their path. This hypothesis explains why the buildings survived intact. A giant wave of water carrying ice and debris possesses colossal destructive kinetic energy. It would have wiped the cities off the face of the earth. But a sandstorm acts differently. It doesn't strike, it engulfs. Billions of grains of sand driven by wind slowly but relentlessly accumulate against walls, burying streets, windows, doors, gradually interring the city without destroying its structure. The buildings were encased in a sandy sarcophagus that preserved them. So, we have two completely different catastrophes producing the same result in different regions. For coastal areas, an ice tsunami. For the continental interior, apocalyptic sandstorms. But this creates an even more disturbing question. What kind of global event could have occurred on our planet about 150 to 200 years ago that triggered a chain reaction of such diverse cataclysms all over the world? This doesn't look like a series of local incidents. It looks like symptoms of a single global failure in the planetary system. What could cause oceans to overflow their shores in giant icy waves and simultaneously strip the topsoil from continents, turning it into airborne sand? What force could so radically and so quickly change the climate? The answer might be hidden not in geology, but in history, a history that's been carefully edited and sanitized. Because when you start looking at what else was happening in the 19th century, a pattern emerges. A pattern of destruction, of empty cities, of missing populations, and most disturbingly, of countless orphans appearing out of nowhere. Let's talk about the photographs. Not the ones showing buried buildings, but the ones showing the cities after they were excavated. After all that immense effort to dig them out, to restore them to something approaching their original state. These photographs are strange in a way that's hard to articulate at first. The cities look perfect. The streets are immaculately paved. The architecture is flawless. The buildings beautifully restored. Everything speaks of greatness and prosperity. But there's one frightening detail that disturbs this perfect picture. The complete and total absence of people. The streets are empty. The squares are silent. The riverbanks are deserted. It feels like looking at giant, masterfully crafted movie sets after the film crew has left. And the standard explanation, that early camera technology required long exposure times that couldn't capture moving objects, falls apart under scrutiny. Because the pulse of a big city isn't just people rushing by. City life consists of many stationary and slow-moving elements that a long exposure would have been sure to capture. Where are the vendors at their stalls, standing in one place for hours? Where are the goods laid out on trays, the boxes of provisions, the barrels? Where are the horses tied to posts, peacefully chewing hay? These animals could stand still for tens of minutes or hours. Where are the stacks of firewood against the walls, the sacks of coal waiting to be unloaded? Any household clutter that inevitably exists in a lived-in space? The streets in these photographs are sterile, perfectly clean, and when you look up at the buildings themselves, it gets worse. The windows look blind and lifeless. No curtains, no flowers in pots, no clotheslines on the balconies, nothing that would indicate human habitation. But the most eloquent marker is the chimneys. Every house in that era was heated individually. Fire was the heart of any home, used for cooking and warmth. Smoke from a chimney was as essential a sign of life as breath is to a person. and yet, not a single puff of smoke rises from any of these countless chimneys. Not one. The sky above the roofs is perfectly clear. It's statistically impossible to imagine that in a city of many thousands, every single stove was extinguished at the exact same moment. Unless, of course, the houses weren't just empty, they were cold, dead. The cities weren't sleeping. They were frozen in deep, unnatural, suspended animation. These weren't photographs of living cities during off hours. They were photographs of empty shells, prepared and documented before new inhabitants arrived. The perfect condition of everything, the swept streets, the repaired facades, the new glass in windows, all of it suggests massive restoration work had been completed. Someone had gone to enormous effort to make these cities livable again after whatever catastrophe had depopulated them. And that brings us to the question that ties everything together. If the cities were empty, who was going to fill them? The 19th century witnessed an explosion of orphanages unlike anything seen before or since. Not just in one country, but globally. Across Europe, America, Russia, even Australia, a network of institutions sprang up to house an endless stream of parentless children. These weren't modest charity homes. They were enormous, sometimes palatial buildings, capable of holding thousands. According to official records, one such institution alone took in about 4,500 infants, and it was just one of many. A partial list from open sources names more than 64 large orphanages founded in Great Britain alone during that period, and that list is far from complete. Official history tries to explain this surge with wars, the Industrial Revolution, and high mortality from disease. But the scale doesn't match. Wars leave orphans, but those are usually localized tragedies. Epidemics claim lives, but they don't create this specific imbalance, leaving behind millions of children without any care, as if their parents had simply vanished overnight. Could it be that these orphans were the solution to the empty cities? Could they have been the human resource needed to repopulate territories across the globe? The thought seems monstrous until you look at what was actually happening, at how society was being conditioned to accept certain ideas about children. In America, at the turn of the century, a man named Martin Cooney organized traveling exhibitions across the country. Their main attraction was premature babies. In amusement parks and at World's Fairs, amidst rides and vendor stalls, he set up fully functioning intensive care units where visitors could pay a fee to look at tiny infants lying in rows of glass incubators. Life-saving process turned into profitable spectacle. The official story claims Cooney saved around 80,000 babies. But where did such an unimaginable number of premature infants come from? Where were their parents? And why were these exhibits so popular? It's as if people at that time didn't have children of their own, making the sight of an infant a novelty. The whole scenario becomes even stranger when you realize that at many of the same fairs, there were simultaneous expositions dedicated to eugenics, the pseudoscience of selective breeding, the very ideology that would later form the basis for the darkest chapters of 20th century history, peacefully coexisted with pavilions showcasing saved babies. Was this conditioning? A way to normalize the idea that children were objects that could be displayed, evaluated, acquired. The most direct evidence comes from Europe, hidden in the most mundane item of that era: the postcard. In the early 20th century, thousands upon thousands of postcards appeared depicting babies in surreal scenes. Children emerging from cabbage patches, hatching from giant eggs, growing on mushrooms, floating in shells on water, being transported by airship and train. At first glance, they seem like quirky vintage art. But look closer at the inscriptions. Most are in French, but examples exist with American, German, and Dutch postage stamps, indicating this was an international, even global phenomenon. And the inscriptions are not metaphorical. They are commercial. The phrase that repeats with frightening regularity is simple and chilling. À vendre, for sale. This is not a hint, not an allegory, not a joke. It's a direct, unambiguous announcement. One card depicts a fairground scene under a sign reading "Modern Baby Bazaar" with terms like free entry, we fear no competition, everything is for sale, and most chillingly, we do not accept returns. Another shows babies among cabbages with the invitation, choose, the little ones have just grown. Others feature infants sitting in baskets, each with captions like, I will be good, I won't wet the bed, I am cheerful, I will love you, I am cute. Product descriptions aimed at potential buyers. Some images show children locked in cages like pets for sale, with captions leaving no room for imagination. Children for sale. Do you want a baby? These weren't art. They were catalogs. And the popular myths we grew up with, the stories about cabbage patches and storks bringing babies, take on a completely different meaning in this context. What we've always considered innocent explanations for curious children may actually be echoes of a real functioning system. The storks on these postcards are often depicted as couriers, sometimes wearing uniform caps, carrying scales to weigh goods, holding postman's bags. They are part of a transportation system, along with trains, cars, and airships, all shown as means of transporting large groups of infants. The most revealing detail appears on postcards featuring one specific word: repopulation, not adoption, not charity, repopulation. This term leaves no room for ambiguity. This wasn't just about caring for orphans, it was about deliberately settling territories, about filling those empty cities we saw in the photographs. The evidence of a large-scale organized program is undeniable. The orphan trains in the United States transported over 200,000 children from East Coast cities to farms and towns in the Midwest between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries. Official history calls it a social welfare program, but the timing, the scale, the systematic nature of it all points to something more deliberate, a repopulation program. When you connect all the pieces, a picture emerges that official history doesn't want you to see. Empty cities inherited from unknown predecessors, a demographic vacuum that needed filling, millions of orphans appearing simultaneously in a global network of institutions, postcards serving as catalogs offering a product with descriptions and terms of sale, folk myths about cabbage patches and storks acting as symbolic cover for a real, well-oiled distribution system. This was the Great Reset, the reconstruction of civilization after some catastrophic event that led to massive depopulation. But what was that event? What could have caused such devastation? The answer is hidden in the art of that era. Artists we're told were romantics painting imaginary ruins were actually documentarians recording what they saw. Giovanni Battista Piranesi's engravings show a Rome tourists today wouldn't recognize. The Pyramid of Cestius buried deep underground, with people walking at a level that would be several stories high today. The landscape frozen in waves of mud and clay, as if a giant wave of solid matter had washed over the city and hardened. This same scene repeats across Europe. Fedor Matveyev's Italian landscapes show settlements on hills flooded with streams of clay. The mass clearly came from above, flowing down slopes, filling streets, burying the lower floors of buildings. In paintings by Napoleon Orda, we see the Mir and Krivo castles in Belarus, the Ostrog Castle in Ukraine, dozens of monumental structures appearing as majestic ruins, drowning in giant heaps of sand and clay. But the most disturbing images come from Konstantin Bogaevsky. His painting titled The Star Wormwood shows a city being simultaneously flooded by streams of mud and illuminated by a brilliant flash emanating from a single point. Not lightning, not a natural phenomenon, an explosion. The expressive brushstrokes convey matter flying in all directions, a shockwave demolishing everything in its path. The title is a direct reference to the biblical prophecy about a star that fell from the sky and poisoned the waters. Was the artist trying to tell us the catastrophe had a cosmic origin, or something even more terrifying, a man-made origin with consequences comparable to the biblical end of the world? The physical evidence supports this interpretation. In the ancient city of Khiva in Uzbekistan, we find massive fortress walls up to 5 meters thick, built of countless baked clay bricks. The southern part looks as if giant chunks were ripped out of it. What battering ram or primitive cannon could break through a wall that thick? Even a modern tank would struggle. The destruction is massive and chaotic, as if struck by an element of colossal inhuman power. And in the thick layers of compressed clay forming hills at the foot of these ancient walls, you can find something that dismisses any theory of slow cultural accumulation. Human, bones sticking right out of the earth. Not ancient burials. Fragments of wrists and shin bones embedded in the geological stratum, arranged chaotically without any order. People were caught completely by surprise. This gigantic mass of clay and mud didn't just bury an already abandoned city. It collapsed on it suddenly, covering it along with all its inhabitants, burying them alive in an instant. The scale of destruction and instantaneous death of an entire city suggests this was no ordinary natural disaster. And when you look at the pattern globally, the same signature appears everywhere: an impact from above, massive volumes of clay, subsequent reclaiming by survivors. From sunny Italy to Central Asia to Eastern Europe, the disaster has the same characteristics. This wasn't a local earthquake or volcanic eruption, it was a global event. What force is capable of causing flows of clay to fall from the sky and purposefully wipe entire cities off the face of the earth? The answer may lie in the civilization that came before us. Because when you examine the architecture that survived, when you measure the doorways and calculate the dimensions, an unavoidable conclusion emerges. These structures weren't built for people our size. The doorways are tens of meters high, tall enough for a giraffe to walk through freely. The stair steps reach a person's waist or chest, making them almost impossible for an ordinary person to climb. Window openings look like triumphal arches. Ceilings are lost at such heights that any light source available in that era would have simply dissipated before reaching the floor. This isn't hyperbole or artistic exaggeration. It's a consistently applied architectural standard running through structures all over the world. From Europe to Asia, the same symbols appear on facades. Griffins rendered in similar style on buildings separated by thousands of miles. This isn't coincidence. It's an architectural language, a unified code proving these structures had a single cultural source, a global civilization. And that civilization wasn't human, at least not human as we are now. Museums and collections overflow with objects a modern human physically could not use. Books of incredible dimensions too heavy to read while holding. Musical instruments calculated for giants, organs, double basses, octobasses, huge drums, trumpets, saxophones, requiring lung capacity and finger length we simply don't possess. Weapons that defy explanation, two-handed swords impossible to fence with, effectively at standard human height, rifles of colossal size with rifling and stocks, showing signs of individual fitting. These weren't decorative. They were functional weapons for beings of completely different proportions. The architecture tells the same story. Doors of immense height with handles positioned far above a modern person's head. Giant mirrors and corresponding furniture. Ancient structures with huge steps later roughly hewn down, or supplemented with smaller stairs to adapt them for our stride. And across the world, in Germany and elsewhere, cyclopean sarcophagi and footprints of giant feet frozen in stone. Art documented this coexistence. On ancient bas-reliefs, sculptures, and canvases by masters like Jan van Eyck, figures are depicted towering over other participants. Engravings show daily life in detail, like smoking accessories, the real prototypes of which, huge pipes kept in museum storage, look absolutely unusable for us. The sizes aren't uniform. Some buildings are clearly created for beings about 3.5 meters tall. Other, even more grandiose structures imply the existence of beings up to 15 meters in height. This disparity suggests different species of intelligent beings with radically different physical parameters existed on Earth simultaneously or sequentially. Historical chronicles preserve information about finds of remains of incredible proportions. From a skeleton nearly 6 meters tall, discovered in Lucerne, Switzerland at the end of the 16th century, to 7-meter remains in France, to mentions of bones of beings reaching almost 11 meters in height. These aren't myths, they're documented discoveries. But modern biomechanics insists such creatures couldn't function biologically. With Earth's gravity, bones that size wouldn't support body weight, and the heart couldn't pump blood to such heights. This argument is valid only if we consider conditions on our planet to be unchanging constants. But what if they're not? What if the giants formed and functioned in conditions of significantly lower gravity than what we experience today? According to information preserved by Macedonian priests, the Titans were stellar engineers who knew how to create habitable worlds. They used asteroids as blanks for future planets. The technology involved finding a suitable celestial body, making a deep puncture in its rock, and pumping a special substance inside. Under the influence of the reaction that followed, the asteroid would expand rapidly, increasing in volume like a plastic preform inflating during bottle production. The density of matter dropped. The object's size increased manifold, ensuring comfortable low gravity on the surface. After reaching necessary dimensions, an atmosphere was formed, and flora and fauna introduced. On such artificially created arcs, the giants traveled across the universe, possibly integrating their worlds into existing solar systems to obtain stellar energy. And here's the radical proposition. Earth is an artificially expanded object. This explains the geological phenomenon of planetary expansion, confirmed by the fact that outlines of all modern continents fit perfectly into a single hole on a globe of significantly smaller diameter. The catalyst for this expansion process is a real mineral, lorandite. Not mythical, but a very real, extremely rare thallium arsenic sulfosalt with characteristic carmine red color and diamond luster. The only deposit on the planet with large reserves is located in the Al-Shar mountain massif in Macedonia. The geographical coincidence linking Macedonian legends and scientific facts is striking. In the scientific world, lorandite is invaluable because of its unique physical properties. It's used to detect solar neutrinos and participate in complex nuclear reactions. But according to ancient knowledge, the mineral's potential goes far beyond this. It's claimed that with lorandite, one can generate antimatter and create local anti-gravity fields. Macedonian priests made special pyramid-shaped amulets from this stone that Alexander the Great and his generals wore. Since the 1990s, the territory around lorandite deposits has been under close surveillance and protection by military structures, including American contingents. Why such secrecy around a simple geological mineral? Unless, of course, its true purpose is far more serious than official science admits. It's impossible not to draw a parallel with James Cameron's Avatar, where the plot revolves around extracting a rare mineral called unobtainium with anti-gravity properties. Many believe Cameron is an insider transmitting hidden information through cinematic images. Lorandite looks like the real prototype of that fictional mineral. If the giants used this mineral to create planets and manipulate gravity, it explains how they could exist comfortably. They lived in a world where physical laws were tuned for them, a technological paradise with low gravity and ideal environment. But today we see a completely different picture. Where did this paradise vanish? Why is modern humanity forced to survive in conditions of aggressive climate, high atmospheric pressure, and gravity that literally presses us to the ground? The answer lies in catastrophic changes to our planet's atmosphere. Before the events of the 19th century, Earth was essentially a giant greenhouse. High in the atmosphere was a dense water vapor canopy, acting as an ideal thermoregulator. This dome created uniform mild climate over the entire surface, from equator to poles, excluding the existence of scorched deserts and zones of permafrost. Confirmation comes from numerous antique statues and images found in regions where cold winters reign today. People are invariably depicted in light tunics or completely naked. You cannot find a statue of a man in a sheepskin coat, which would be absurd for modern climates of those latitudes. Ancient maps of northern regions, like the legendary Hyperborea, show land free of ice where ancestors lived. The North Pole being a lifeless icy desert today is not the norm, but the consequence of a global accident. The fragile balance was disturbed in the early 19th century as a result of massive conflict involving powerful weapons. Explosions lifted colossal amounts of dust and soot into the stratosphere. When these particles reached the vapor canopy, they became condensation centers. The water vapor shell that had held in the atmosphere for millennia lost stability and poured down in monstrous rains of biblical scale. This is the Great Flood as a physical event, not religious metaphor. In polar regions, due to air circulation peculiarities and sharp temperature drops, this water fell as icy slush and snow, instantly freezing everything living. Current ice caps of Greenland and Antarctica are not the result of precipitation accumulation over millions of years. They're the frozen waters of that flood. The melting today is actually the planet returning to its original pre-catastrophe state. But the most dramatic consequence wasn't temperature change. It was a sharp drop in atmospheric pressure. The water that left the atmosphere for the ocean ceased to press on the air's surface. Pressure dropped by almost half. For giant organisms whose physiology depended on dense atmosphere, this was a death sentence. Moving became incredibly difficult. They began to degenerate rapidly. In rare documentary footage and photographs of the 19th century, tall people are often captured with canes or crutches, not a fashion statement, but evidence of painful struggle with their own weight in a world that ceased to support them. But this change hit modern humans too. We became hostages of this new rarefied environment. Our bodies were forced to seek ways to survive in conditions for which they weren't originally designed. A vivid marker of this struggle is our physiological dependence on table salt. Salt retains water, increasing blood and lymph volume, allowing us to artificially maintain necessary intracellular pressure. Our constant desire to salt food is the body's unconscious attempt to even out the balance and approximate conditions it was designed for. This operation in emergency mode leads to premature wear of all life support systems. Studies show the biological resource of our internal organs is calculated for much longer periods. The human liver's potential is estimated at 500 to 600 years. This organ possesses unique ability to regenerate, which in modern conditions is practically unrealized. We burn through this giant resource in 70 or 80 years, simply trying to maintain homeostasis in an aggressive environment with low pressure and hard radiation from which the vapor shell no longer protects us. We've lost not only physical longevity and giant stature, humanity likely lost access to hidden reserves of its own body and consciousness. Physical degradation was accompanied by loss of unique technologies for interacting with matter. Testimonies hint that ancestors possessed ways to overcome gravity without complex mechanisms, relying only on knowledge of acoustics and resonance. Archives preserve unique testimonies from Macedonia, recording practices that seem impossible to modern physics. We're talking about concrete applied methodology that local residents used to cross water barriers. People gathered in groups and formed a closed chain holding hands. They performed special rhythmic songs, monitoring tonality and frequency. The human body, consisting mainly of water, is an excellent conductor of vibrations. The group acted as a single living resonator circuit. As singing tonality changed, vibration increased, and the group entered acoustic resonance with environment. At the peak frequency, the chain opened. Energy accumulated was released directionally, acting on the person closest to water's edge. Momentary levitation occurred. The person soared into the air and was smoothly transferred to the opposite bank. In this way, rivers up to 20 meters wide could be crossed effortlessly. This proves ancestors possessed deep understanding of the wave nature of matter. They knew sound is not just vibration of air, but a powerful tool capable of changing physical characteristics of space and overcoming gravity. What laboratories try to recreate with super-powerful emitters to levitate a drop of water was previously available to ordinary people, thanks to knowledge of correct frequencies and collective interaction. But the presence of such fundamental knowledge has always caused concern among those striving for total control. Keepers of ancient wisdom capable of controlling forces of nature represented a threat to the established system. Macedonia, which for centuries preserved these skills and high concentration of people possessing priestly knowledge, became target of a geopolitical operation whose goal was complete replacement of the ethnicity holding the information. The tragedy of modern Macedonia serves as grim example of how strategy of soft takeover and erasure of historical memory is implemented. Social cataclysms that looked like spontaneous conflicts actually had clear vector. During the Yugoslav crisis, military actions and NATO bombings created controlled corridor for migration. Through this corridor, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Albania were directed into historically Macedonian lands. Not chaotic flight, but planned resettlement. Having settled on new lands, newcomers quickly legalized themselves, moved numerous families, received citizenship. This launched mechanism of demographic bomb. High birth rates and clan cohesion allowed new population, in incredibly short time, literally within a decade, to increase numbers to 500,000 people, radically changing balance of power in the small state. Soon quantity grew into political quality. Representatives of new diaspora began penetrating all power structures: parliament, courts, police, mass media. Replacement of elites occurred. Indigenous population, Macedonians whose ancestors knew secrets of acoustic resonance and kept memory of giants, found themselves pushed to margins of social life. Today they increasingly occupy low-skilled jobs, sweeping streets, working in service sector, while management of their country passes into foreign hands. This process of destroying cultural code through population replacement happens quietly, without loud battles, but with irreversible efficiency. It's not just a people being destroyed, but a carrier of unique information about our planet's past. Knowledge about levitation, the mineral laurendite, technologies of giants passed down through generations. Now this chain is being broken. New masters of the land have no connection with its deep past. For them, it's simply territory for living. This scenario, tested in the Balkans, is becoming increasingly visible today in prosperous countries of Europe and America. Ancient history is being erased to make way for a new world order where there is no place for miracles of the past. Look around. Do you not notice that in your country right now, exactly the same plan of silent conquest and oblivion is being implemented? We began with giants who disappeared under influence of climatic catastrophes. We traced the evidence through buried cities, empty photographs, countless orphans, and postcards advertising children for sale. We found weapons of unimaginable power used in a 19th century conflict that destroyed the vapor canopy and triggered the Great Flood. We discovered a global civilization of beings far more advanced than us, living in artificially created conditions of low gravity, made possible by a rare mineral still guarded today by military forces. And we end with what's happening right now outside your windows. Technologies are being forgotten. Giants have died out. Peoples preserving memory of all this are methodically being replaced by others who have no connection to the deep past. History is not a smooth progression. It's a series of catastrophic resets, each one erasing what came before, each one requiring the world to be repopulated and rebuilt. The official story you've been taught is a comfortable lie designed to hide the truth about who we really are, what abilities we once possessed, and what kind of world we actually live in. The evidence has always been there, hiding in plain sight. The buried windows, the empty cities, the orphan trains, the postcards, the cyclopean architecture, the giant weapons, the artists documenting catastrophe, the legends of floods and fallen stars. They were just waiting for someone to start asking the right questions. Now you have the answers. What you do with them is up to you.